Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at tariffs, their history, their use as a political tool, and the impact they have on international relations and consumers like you. We'll be using excerpts from The Role and Impact of Tariffs, Economic, Political, and Consumer Implications to guide our conversation today.
All right. Tariffs have been around for centuries, going all the way back to mercantilism. So back then, nations used them to protect their own industries and accumulate wealth.
So let's go back to that period for a sec. What was the thinking around trade during the mercantilist era?
Well, they believed that a nation's economic strength was directly tied to its holdings of gold and silver. To maximize these holdings, they advocated for policies that promoted exports and restricted imports. Tariffs were key for this. By taxing imported goods, they made them more expensive, thus encouraging consumers to buy domestically produced goods instead. This boosted domestic industries and increased the nation's wealth.
It makes sense, kind of trying to create a closed loop where the wealth stays within the country.
Exactly. The goal was to create a favorable balance of trade, where a nation exports more than it imports, leading to an inflow of gold and silver, making the nation richer and more powerful.
It's interesting how those ideas, while no longer dominant, still kind of echo in some of the modern arguments around trade.
Absolutely. You can see elements of mercantilist thinking in protectionist policies, which aim to shield domestic industries from foreign competition. As we've learned from history, these policies can have unintended consequences.
One of the most striking examples would be the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 in the United States.
Precisely. The Smoot-Hawley Act, intended to protect American farmers and manufacturers during the Great Depression, ended up being pretty devastating to the global economy.
Can you unpack that a little? What exactly happened after Smoot-Hawley was passed?
Sure. The act raised tariffs on thousands of imported goods to record levels. They thought by making foreign goods more expensive, American consumers would just buy American-made products and boost the economy.
Yeah, it seemed like a good idea at the time.
Yes, but other countries retaliated, imposing their own tariffs on American goods, triggering a global trade war. International trade plummeted, deepening the depression worldwide. We learn a harsh lesson about the interconnectedness of the global economy and the unintended consequences of tariffs.
This experience seems to have shaped the global approach to trade after World War II.
Absolutely. The Smoot-Hawley Act led to a shift towards trade liberalization after the war. There was a recognition that open markets and reduced trade barriers were essential for global economic recovery and growth.
And this led to GATT and the WTO.
Yes. GATT was signed in 1947. With the goal of reducing tariffs and other trade barriers among member countries, it was a major step towards a more open and rules-based global trading system.
And the World Trade Organization, or WTO, essentially continued and expanded that mission.
Exactly. The WTO, established in 1995, succeeded GATT. It broadened the scope of trade agreements to include services and intellectual property, and strengthened the dispute settlement mechanism. The WTO's core principles are non-discrimination, transparency, and predictability in international trade.
So after this historical overview, let's fast forward to today. Examine the arguments for and against using tariffs in the current global context.
The debate over tariffs is often framed as protectionism versus free trade. Protectionists advocate for tariffs and other trade barriers to shield domestic industries from foreign competition. They argue that these measures are necessary to protect jobs, promote domestic industries, and safeguard national security.
What are some of the specific arguments?
One is that tariffs can help level the playing field when domestic industries face unfair competition from foreign companies that benefit from government subsidies or lower labor costs. Tariffs counteract these advantages and create a more equitable, competitive environment.
This argument comes up when we talk about manufacturing jobs and globalization.
Yes, exactly. Protectionists argue that tariffs can help prevent job losses in sectors that are vulnerable to competition from imports, particularly in manufacturing. They point to the decline of certain industries in developed countries and attribute it to unfair trade practices by countries with lower wages.
But there's another side to this.
Yes, the free trade perspective. Proponents of free trade argue that tariffs and other trade barriers distort markets, ultimately harming consumers and the economy as a whole. They contend that free trade allows for specialization and efficiency, leading to lower prices, increased consumer choice, and overall economic growth.
So from a free trade standpoint, tariffs are an interference in the natural flow of goods and services across borders.
Exactly. Free trade advocates believe that markets should be allowed to function without government intervention. They argue that tariffs introduce inefficiencies and create artificial barriers, hindering economic growth. They also point out that tariffs often lead to higher prices for consumers, as they pay more for imported goods.
So you have these two very different views on the role of tariffs in global trade. How do we reconcile them?
It's not simple. Both sides have valid points. The optimal approach often depends on the specific circumstances and goals. There are instances where tariffs might be justified, such as national security concerns or unfair trade practices. However, it's crucial to weigh the potential costs and benefits.
And one of the most significant costs is often borne by consumers, who end up paying higher prices.
Absolutely. When tariffs are imposed on imported goods, the costs are typically passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. This can reduce consumer purchasing power and lead to a decline in overall economic welfare.
So even if a tariff is meant to protect domestic industries, it can have a negative impact on consumers who rely on imported goods.
That's correct. It's a trade-off that policymakers must consider. In some cases, the benefits of protecting certain industries might outweigh the cost to consumers. However, it's essential to assess the overall impact on the economy, taking into account all stakeholders. It's not just consumers either. Tariffs can have broader ripple effects.
What do you mean? What kind of ripple effects?
Well, one concern is retaliatory tariffs from other countries. When one country imposes tariffs on imports from another, it often triggers a response in kind. This can escalate into a trade war, with tariffs going back and forth, leading to higher costs for businesses and consumers on both sides.
We've seen that recently.
Yeah. The trade war between the United States and China that began in 2018. The U.S. imposed tariffs on billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. China responded with tariffs on American products. This really impacted global trade, raising prices for consumers.
So even if a country thinks it's helping by imposing tariffs, it risks starting a trade war.
Right, and that can hurt everyone. Trade wars rarely have clear winners. They often result in higher costs, reduced trade, and economic uncertainty.
And trade disputes can create tension between countries, can't they?
Absolutely. Trade and politics are linked. Tariffs are a tool of foreign policy. Governments may use tariffs to exert pressure on other countries, or punish them for certain actions, or to gain leverage in negotiations.
So they are a way to reward or punish other countries.
Yeah. They can be an incentive to encourage certain behaviors or a punishment for actions deemed unacceptable. The way tariffs are used can signal a shift in geopolitical dynamics and alliances.
You mentioned earlier that tariffs can address unfair trade practices. Can you give some examples of that?
Sure. Sometimes tariffs are implemented to counter unfair trade practices by other countries. This could be like dumping, where goods are sold in foreign markets at prices below their production cost, or government subsidies that give foreign companies an advantage.
So in those cases, tariffs are a way to ensure fair competition.
Exactly. The idea is to protect domestic industries from practices that are harmful to their competitiveness. It's important to note that determining what is an unfair trade practice can be subjective, often leading to disputes between countries.
So who decides what is unfair?
That's where organizations like the World Trade Organization come in. The WTO has rules for resolving trade disputes between countries. If a country thinks another country is engaging in unfair trade practices, they can file a complaint with the WTO. The WTO will then investigate and make a ruling.
So they're like a referee for global trade?
Yes. It provides a framework for resolving disputes and ensuring that trade is conducted fairly. But the WTO's dispute settlement system is not perfect. Some argue that it's too slow and cumbersome, while others contend that it's biased against developing countries.
So even with institutions like the WTO, regulating global trade and resolving disputes is still difficult?
Absolutely. Global trade is complex and always changing. New challenges are emerging, like how to regulate digital trade and how to address environmental concerns. The rules and institutions that govern global trade need to adapt to these changes.
And tariffs will likely continue to be important.
Without a doubt, tariffs are a powerful tool that governments can use to shape trade flows and achieve their objectives. They can be used for good or for ill. Their impact can be wide-reaching. It's essential to understand the complexities of tariffs so that we can engage in informed debates and ensure that they are used responsibly and effectively.
Now let's look at the domestic political landscape and how tariffs play a role in shaping political decisions.
Tariffs often become a focal point in political debates, particularly during elections. As we discussed, tariffs can have a big impact on specific industries and communities. Politicians use tariffs to appeal to certain voter groups or to advance their agendas.
What are some examples of how tariffs have been used in political campaigns?
Sure. In the 2016 U.S. presidential election, Donald Trump campaigned on a platform of protectionism, promising to bring back manufacturing jobs and renegotiate trade deals that he deemed unfair to American workers. He often criticized China and pledged to impose tariffs on Chinese goods.
And once he was elected, he followed through.
Yes. The Trump administration initiated a trade war with China, imposing tariffs on billions of dollars worth of Chinese imports. These tariffs were met with retaliatory tariffs from China, leading to higher costs for everyone.
So the tariffs were a campaign promise,
Yeah,
meant to appeal to his voters.
exactly. The tariffs were part of a broader strategy to promote American manufacturing and reduce the trade deficit with China. However, the effectiveness of this strategy is debated, and the economic consequences of the trade war are still being felt.
You said tariffs can have a big impact on specific industries and communities. Can you expand on that?
Of course, when tariffs are imposed on imported goods, there are winners and losers. Industries that rely heavily on those imported goods may face higher costs, which could lead to job losses or reduced profits.
So, for example, if we put tariffs on steel imports, that could hurt the auto industry.
Exactly. The auto industry would face higher costs, their cars more expensive and less competitive. But the domestic steel industry might benefit, as they would face less competition.
So different industries are affected differently.
Yes, it's a complex web of interconnected industries and interests. The impact of tariffs is rarely uniform. Some sectors benefit, while others suffer. Policymakers need to consider these effects when making decisions about tariffs.
And often, these decisions are influenced by lobbying.
Absolutely. Industries that benefit from tariffs will lobby for them, while industries that will be hurt by tariffs will lobby against them. This creates a tug of war as policymakers try to balance competing interests.
What are some industries that have lobbied for or against tariffs?
In the U.S., the steel industry has lobbied hard for tariffs on imported steel, arguing that they are necessary to protect American jobs and prevent unfair competition. They have been successful in persuading the government to impose tariffs.
And what about industries that have lobbied against?
Industries that rely heavily on imported goods, such as retail and manufacturing, often oppose tariffs. They argue that tariffs increase their costs, making their products less competitive. The retail industry, for example, has lobbied against tariffs on goods from China, arguing that they would lead to higher prices and harm the economy.
So it's a constant battle between different groups.
Right, trying to influence trade policy. This highlights the political complexities of tariffs. They are not just an economic tool, they are a political weapon that can be used to benefit certain groups at the expense of others.
This brings us to another important aspect, the impact on developing economies.
Yes, tariffs can have a big impact on developing countries, which often rely heavily on trade for growth. They may lack the resources to compete effectively.
So tariffs imposed by developed countries can be a big problem.
Absolutely. When developed countries impose tariffs, it can restrict access to markets, limit export earnings, and hinder economic development. This is especially true for countries that specialize in agriculture or manufacturing.
Are there examples of how tariffs have hurt developing economies?
Yes. The cotton industry in West Africa. Subsidies provided to American cotton farmers have made it difficult for West African cotton producers to compete. These subsidies, along with tariffs on imported cotton, have depressed prices for West African cotton, hindering the economic development of the region.
So tariffs and protectionist measures have created an unlevel playing field.
Exactly. It highlights the challenges developing countries face. In advocating for their interests in the global trading system, they often lack the political power or resources to challenge the policies of more powerful nations.
And this raises questions about fairness in global trade.
Indeed. The debate over tariffs is not just about economics. It also involves ethical considerations about the distribution of benefits and burdens. There's an ongoing discussion about how to create a more just and equitable trading system that promotes sustainable development for all countries.
And speaking of sustainable development, let's talk about the future of tariffs in a world focused on climate change.
As the world tries to reduce carbon emissions and transition to a more sustainable economy, the role of tariffs is likely to evolve. We're already seeing new tariff concepts, such as carbon tariffs, designed to address environmental concerns.
Can you explain what carbon tariffs are?
Sure. The basic idea is to impose a tax on imported goods from countries that don't have strict environmental regulations, especially those related to carbon emissions. This is intended to create a level playing field. and to incentivize countries to adopt more sustainable practices.
So it's a way to use trade policy to address climate change.
Exactly. Carbon tariffs could be powerful in reducing global carbon emissions and promoting sustainable development. But they also raise complex questions about fairness, practicality, and potential trade disputes.
What are those concerns?
One concern is that carbon tariffs could be seen as protectionist measures. Disguised as environmental policies, developing countries in particular might argue that they are unfairly penalized for their lower levels of development and their limited ability to adopt costly environmental regulations.
So carbon tariffs could increase inequalities in global trade.
Yes, it's essential to ensure that carbon tariffs are fair, taking into account the different circumstances of developing and developed countries.
What about the practical challenges of implementing carbon tariffs?
One challenge is determining the level of carbon tariffs and how to measure the carbon footprint of imported goods. This is complex, as it involves accounting for emissions throughout the entire supply chain.
It sounds very complicated.
It is. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of developing a robust and transparent system for measuring and verifying carbon emissions. Additionally, there are concerns about trade disputes if countries disagree on how to calculate carbon tariffs.
So carbon tariffs are promising, but also present challenges.
That's right. They represent a new frontier in trade policy, one that requires careful consideration of both the economic and the environmental implications.
As we move further into the 21st century, the global trade landscape is becoming more and more complex, with factors like climate change and tech advancements adding new wrinkles to the debate over tariffs.
Right. The traditional arguments for and against tariffs are being reshaped by these emerging challenges. We need to think beyond protectionism versus free trade and consider how tariffs can be used to address issues like environmental sustainability and global competitiveness in a rapidly changing world.
Let's dig into that a little deeper. How might these factors affect the future of tariffs?
One area where we'll probably see big changes is in the use of tariffs to promote environmental sustainability. As climate change becomes more urgent, governments are looking for ways to encourage businesses to reduce their carbon footprint and transition to cleaner technologies.
And could tariffs play a role there?
Yes, potentially. As we said earlier, carbon tariffs could be a tool to create a level playing field between countries with different environmental standards. By imposing a tax on imported goods from countries with weaker environmental regulations, carbon tariffs could encourage those countries to adopt stricter standards and reduce their emissions.
But we also talked about the concerns about fairness and practicality, especially for developing countries.
Yes, that's right. For carbon tariffs to be effective, we would need a really good system for measuring carbon emissions across global supply chains, and we'd also have to think about the impact on developing economies to make sure they're not unfairly penalized.
So it's complicated.
Very much so. Designing and implementing carbon tariffs would require careful consideration to avoid unintended consequences like trade wars or increased inequality.
And of course, technology is another factor. Automation and AI are changing things.
Absolutely. Technological advancements are changing the nature of work and global production. Automation, for example, is increasing efficiency and reducing labor costs. This could make tariffs less effective as a way to protect domestic jobs, as labor costs become less important in trade.
So the argument that tariffs protect jobs from going overseas might not be as relevant in the future.
It's possible. As automation advances, low labor costs might not be such a big advantage, and trade policy might focus on other things, like access to technology, innovation, and intellectual property.
So tariffs as we know them might need to change.
Exactly. The reasons for using tariffs might evolve. In a world where technology is rapidly changing things, tariffs might be used to promote innovation, support new technologies, or address global challenges like climate change or cybersecurity.
This goes back to our original question. Are tariffs good or bad?
It's a tough one. They can be used for good or for bad. Their impact depends on the context, the motivations of policymakers, and the bigger economic and political picture.
So it's not that tariffs themselves are good or bad, it's how they're used.
Right. Tariffs can protect domestic industries, promote fair trade, address environmental concerns, or advance economic goals. But they can also distort markets, punish rivals, trigger trade wars, or make global inequality worse.
It seems like the main point is that tariffs are a powerful tool with big consequences. They should be used carefully.
I agree. The debate over tariffs is complex. It requires an understanding of economics, politics, and ethics. There are no easy answers. The best approach depends on the situation. But by having informed discussions about tariffs, we can work towards a global trading system that is fair, sustainable, and beneficial for everyone.
Thank you for this deep dive into the world of tariffs. It's been very informative, and I think our listeners will have a much better understanding of this complex issue.
It was my pleasure. The debate over tariffs is sure to continue. And it's important that we stay informed as we navigate the challenges and opportunities of a globalized world.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.